This is Northleach, a small town in the English Cotswold Hills. And this is Bruges, a city in Belgium, the country once called Flanders. Northleach is more like a quiet country village than a town, quite different from Bruges. Bruges is a busy, crowded tourist centre. You wouldn't think there was anything much to connect Northleach and Bruges. But in the Middle Ages, wool from the Cotswolds was sold to Flanders, where it was turned into cloth and sold all over Europe. Today we're going to see how the wool got to Bruges from the Cotswolds. Well, first you had to grow it. Luckily, we still have lots of pictures showing how sheep were reared. This is a picture of shepherds working. One is watching, while the other is holding his sheepdog. When the rams were ready to mate, they often fought each other. Once the lambs were born, the ewes could be milked to make cheese. Cheese was an important English export. In summer, the sheep were sheared. This was done by specially trained men and women called clippers. The shepherds, or clippers, couldn't do proper sums, but as the sheep passed by, they recited counting words like this: onerum, tworum, cockerum, shurum, sliggerum, sladderum, wineberry, wagtail, tarrydiddle, den. Onerum, tworum, cockerum, shurum, sliggerum, sladderum, wineberry, wagtail, tarrydiddle, den. And they cut a notch in their tally stick for every score or 20 that passed by. Once the fleeces had been cleaned, they could be sold to a wool broker. And many of these wool brokers, men and women, became very rich through the buying and selling of wool. One of them, John 40, could afford to have his local church rebuilt. And when he died in 1458, he was buried inside it in a magnificent tomb. Here's John's tomb. It's covered with a plate of brass with his portrait engraved on it. The brass was imported from abroad, but the portrait was made by a local craftsman. John was so proud of being a successful wool broker that he had himself shown with one foot on a sheep and the other on a wool pack. This idea was taken up by other wool brokers. Who did the Northleach wool brokers sell to? Well, one of their customers was a man called William Stoner, and we know quite a lot about him from his letters, which still exist today. He used to live in the house down there, Stoner Park. It was one of the first houses to be built of brick. Brickmaking was a new skill, learnt from Flanders. Like his descendants today, William Stoner was a country gentleman. But in 1475, he married the daughter of a city merchant. She encouraged him to go into business with a friend of hers, Thomas Betson. William and Thomas became merchants of the staple, members of a company which bought wool in England and sold it in Calais. Calais, which belonged to England, was the only place where the king allowed wool to be sold to foreigners. But William didn't only buy wool in Northleach, he reared sheep of his own. And this ancient track is part of an old drover's road. Over there is the pub, where the drovers used to stop for a drink on the way. Once the sheep had been sheared, the wool was stored in one of the outbuildings of the house. Nowadays it's a hayloft. In William's day, this loft was piled high with wool, packed, ready to be checked by an official of the company of the staple. The wool sacks looked something like this, but they each weighed about 15.5 stone, which is very heavy indeed. So the corners were tied like this, which made them easier to handle. Once the official had checked that the wool was good and that it hadn't been padded out with thistles or other rubbish, he put the merchant stapler's own mark on every sack. And this was to make sure that the wool couldn't be confused with someone else's. Here's William Stoner's mark, and we can easily make out the S. After the wool had been checked, it was either loaded onto pack horses and sent overland to London, or one of the other big ports, or, because it was often safer to travel by water, it might have gone straight down the Thames by barge, a journey of 4 to 5 days. Merchants like William Stoner and Thomas Betson kept...
We're very sorry we seem to have lost for the moment the Middle Ages. In the meantime, a little music. The Middle Ages.
You weighed it using a balance like this. Now, this coin here should balance with the weight on the other end. And it does. Now, once he'd been paid, a merchant needed somewhere safe to keep his money. And medieval safes were called strong boxes, because that's what they were, strong, usually made of iron, which made them very difficult to break into. William also kept his business records in a strong box, and among these were his lists of the number and value of sacks that he had packed ready for selling. And we know that in 1 month alone, he and Thomas Betson sold 2,428 sacks of wool in Calais. But before the sacks could be sent there, they had first to be weighed on the King's weighbeam, a special kind of weighing machine. The partners had to pay the king a tax on each sack. This wool tax, as it was known, was a very important source of income for the king. And to show that each sack had been properly weighed and taxed, an official of the staple put a seal on it. And the seal had a picture of the wool sack. Finally, a customs officer wrote down all the details and gave the merchant a document called a cocket. This showed how many sacks the merchant was selling and the amount of tax he paid on them. And only after all this could Thomas Betson take his sacks and arrange to have them put on board his ship. If you've ever crossed the Channel, you know that it can be quite uncomfortable, even on a big ship like this ferry. Medieval ships were much smaller. Ports used to have their own seals, sometimes with the picture of a ship on them. So we can guess that Thomas Betson might have sailed in a keel, like this. If he used a hulk or three-master, like this, he could have carried more cargo. But these ships weren't easy to steer, and there were other problems too. There were no proper charts to navigate by, no radar, only a primitive compass, and no distress rockets either, if the ship sailed onto the rocks. Instead, you had a barrel of tar to set fire to let other ships know that you were in trouble. But that wasn't always a good idea. The Channel swarmed with pirates, and you had to be ready to fight them off. A letter of the time tells how one merchant ship was chased by the Scots betwixt Dover and Calais. They had a very narrow escape. William Stoner never lost a ship, but he must always have been glad to have received letters like this one. 1476. I departed the 11th day of April, and so came to Calais upon Shrove Thursday last with the wool ships. And so, blessed be Jesu, I have arrived with your wools in safety. In the Middle Ages, people sometimes dated events by the church calendar, and this can be very confusing. But historians have worked out that that crossing took only 1 day, which was very quick. In bad weather, it could take 2 weeks. And did you notice that the letter said wool ships? That was because merchants of the staple usually travelled in convoy, so that they could protect one another from enemies. Once in Calais, the master of the ship had to be paid, the harbour authorities had to be paid, and officers of the staple checked to see that the same amount of wool arrived that was listed on the cocket. That was because some people tried to smuggle extra wool in tax-free. After all this, Thomas could get down to the business of selling. Two of his best customers were Peter and Daniel van der Rade from Bruges. In times of peace, the van der Rades took the wool home overland. But if times were unsettled, they went by sea. From Calais, in France, they sailed around the coast of Flanders to the port of Sluis, then upriver to Bruges, a splendid city with towering spires. Around the city ran a canal. On the inside was a high bank, crowned with windmills, and entered by fortified gatehouses. In the 15th century, you could sail through some of the gates and on into the town. From this boat I'm on, I can see a lot of the buildings that the van der Rades used to know, like this hospital. There were fine brick houses, churches, almshouses, and public buildings. Bruges was one of the greatest international trading towns of 15th century Europe. The town hall had coats of arms carved on it, showing some of the other towns in Flanders which traded with Bruges. But overseas trade was so important that the city had special areas set aside just for foreign merchants. The most important group of foreign traders were the Easterlings, people from Germany and the Baltic, who had banded together into an association called the Hanseatic League, a lot like an early form of the common market. The Easterlings sold mostly metals, furs, and fish. In 1478, their headquarters in Easterling Square was replaced by a brand new building, this one. The second most important group of traders was the Italians. This house belonged to traders from Genoa in Italy. The Italians specialised in spices and silks. This is the square of the Biscayans, people from the Bay of Biscay. They sold salt and sailcloth. Turkish carpets were as famous then as they are today. That tower is on top of a building which belonged to the Turks. Nowadays, Spanish Quay is a quiet backwater, but then it was crowded with people unloading spices, leather, oranges and lemons, and the second best wool. The best came from England. And that's the Scottish Quarter, where the Scots, then a separate nation, lived and traded. And here's Engelstraat, English Street. At the far end are the English steps, where the merchants loaded and unloaded their boats. Peter and Daniel van der Rade must have sailed past here on their way to the centre of town. At the end of the canal is a very grand building where the richest citizens met and discussed town business. Just across the street is the customs house, where the van der Rades paid customs duty on the wool they'd bought. And squeezed in beside it is the headquarters of the Dockers Guild. It's quite small because although there were lots of dock workers, they weren't very rich. They worked hard for their money just the same. There's a carving of a docker, bent double beneath a wool pack. Everywhere you go in Bruges, you can see evidence for the wool trade. I'm standing in Wool Street, which is just next to the most famous landmark in Bruges, the bell tower. It's supposed to have been built with money made from the sale of woolen cloth. Beneath the bell tower were these great market halls, where goods from all over Europe were put on sale. Once the van der Raders had had their English wool made up into cloth, it was sold here, alongside the oranges from Spain and the silks from Italy. Now, suppose a Russian wanted to buy some of the van der Raders cloth. How was he to pay for it? Well, even then, there were centres where different currencies could be exchanged, and where bankers and traders could meet together. One of them is still here, and is still used for the same kind of business. You can imagine how rich Bruges became from all the banking and trading that went on. The people who lived here spent their money on fine houses, clothes, feasts, and processions, like this one. All the most important people took part. The nobles, the aldermen, the merchants, the guildsmen, maybe even the brothers van der Rade. But Bruges was already past its peak. The future of the cloth-making industry lay across the channel. You see, back here in England, the king had begun to demand a bigger tax on each sack of wool which was sent out of the country, which helped raise money for his government. But he also added a tax on all woolen cloth which was brought into the country from places like Bruges. Well, this encouraged the English cloth-making business, because it was obviously cheaper to make the cloth here in England than import it. The English trade was also helped by political troubles in Flanders. Some of the Flemish cloth makers had fled to England for safety and taught the secrets of their craft to the English. Some of them were even supposed to have lived in cottages here. Soon cloth-making towns, like Lavenham in Suffolk, were competing with cities like Bruges. Local churches, like this one, were altered or added to by the cloth merchants, who were becoming as rich or richer than the woolmen before them. Thomas Spring of Lavenham was so proud of what he'd built, he had his wool mark put on the outside, and on the inside, a brass memorial showing him and his family rising from the grave. In the long run, England became Europe's biggest manufacturer of woolen cloth. So, from the king and his government, down to the merchants and craftsmen, England's prosperity had a lot to do with the making and selling of cloth.
We apologise for the short interruption in that programme, History, the Middle Ages. Universities getting that degree is the subject of our programme on higher education in just over